Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Veritas Files. My name is Marcos Hernandez.
I'm Josh Gage.
I'm Edward Gellerman.
So last time we talked about sin, and it was Adam and Eve's choice to disobey God. So why did God allow them to make that decision in the first place?
Marcus, that's a great question. This is a fairly common question you kind of get in the Christian realm. Is kind of like you said, why did God create Adam and Eve if he already knew they were going to sin? Because God is omniscient, so he knows everything, so he must have known the outcome of this. So yeah, very, very logical question. So as we talked about last week, God didn't need to create us. He had no need to create us. The triune Godhead could have lived in complete harmony for all of eternity. But he chose to create us just kind of to glorify himself and also to show his love. And he created us and wanted to have a loving relationship with us, his creation. However, that wouldn't be possible without giving us free will. You can't force someone or something to love you. Forced love isn't love at all. That's just something else. I don't even know what to call that. But love by existence or by definition must be between, multiple parties, and it must be freely given. And God wanted us to have that ability. So as we said, to be able to do that, we had to have the concept of free will. So that free will obviously is going to come with the ability to not love. To be able to love someone, you also must have the option to not love. And that's what the tree in the garden represented for Adam and Eve. It was basically their opportunity to choose to love God by obeying his commandment and not eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge and good and evil, or disobey him and in a sense not love God by eating of the fruit, which is what they ultimately did, and it caused the fall and the sin that we see enter the world today. So some people might also ask, aren't there other options? God, as we said earlier, God created mankind knowing full well what was going to happen. So was there maybe a better way, so to speak, that God could have created the world? Well, let's take a look at that. The first option is, as we said, God could have created nothing at all. As we said, he didn't need to create us. There wasn't any need in him. The triune Godhead could have lived in complete harmony for all of eternity. However, you can't really compare that to the world we see today. You're essentially taking literally nothing and trying to compare it to the evil world we have today. There's no real logical comparison you can make there, as you're basically comparing nothing to something. It doesn't really hold any logical grounds for comparison. The next option he could have had is he could have created a world with, creatures that were sinless but no free will. While this is very possible, it also wouldn't have allowed for all the wonderful things we have, especially that love and that relationship with God, to exist, because it either would have had to be programmed in us to, in a sense, love God, but as we said before, that wouldn't really be love. That would just be a robot trained to do whatever. Or it'd have to be, something else would have to be programmed into us. Whatever it was that would be programmed in would already be there. And it would be a completely amoral option, because there would be no option to do anything else besides what we were programmed or whatever creatures God chose to program to do. So again, we run into kind of the same fallacy as the previous version, is we're trying to compare just like a moral world and just kind of like a moral situation with something that's completely amoral. And again, there's no real logical basis to compare the two. So what I think we can do is take looking at this and just looking at everything we know about God's character and what he's revealed to us, and reasonably conclude that this is the best possible world he could have created for us. And that comes with a lot of great things, but as we said, that had to come with that free will aspect, so we could freely choose to give our love. But also, the flip side of that is we have the option to not choose to love or follow God.
Anything you want to add?
Yeah, essentially, like Josh said, we talked about it last week, but God looked at his creation and called it good. It wasn't necessarily good because he knew that people were always going to be good, but he knew that he created a world that was going to be able to worship him, because like we talked about a couple weeks ago, our prime purpose and the reason that he created us to begin with was to worship him, to serve him, so that we might love him through the option of the free will that Josh talked about. So essentially, it's a good creation in the sense that we're able to have the relationship with God, we're able to serve him. That doesn't necessarily mean we're perfect creations, because obviously I think we can all agree that Josh, myself, Marcos, you are not perfect. But God can essentially make you perfect in the sense that he gave you the free will so that we might worship him, which is our prime responsibility as humans and as his creation.
Could you somehow create some kind of similarity between a parent and a child? So would a parent then have a child to, so that the child worships them?
Are you talking specifically within like the like similarity between God and us as far as creating us and as far as like a parent creating a child?
Right.
I mean, yeah, essentially, like, if you look at a parent, like, they're going to think their child's the best thing ever and they're going to call them perfect. And it's not because they're always going to obey the parent, but it's because it's their creation and they know that child can please them, and they can do what they say sometimes, and that they can raise them up to be who they want them to be, per se. And so, yeah, I think there is a strong similarity. Of course, it's a little bit different because obviously my earthly father is not God, but it is in a sense of the fact that he loves me not because I'm a perfect creation, but because he's the one who created me, and he made me and shaped me a lot into who I am today. And so I'm able to kind of give him a little bit of like the praise for that, because he's ultimately the one who raised me up and the one who I have a good relationship with today.
We still see a lot of evil in the world today. So does that mean that a good God can't exist?
That is another very good question, Marcos. And I think it's one of the more common questions you get when you're talking about Christianity and the beliefs we hold. And honestly, I think it's a very important question for all of us to think through, whether you are a Christian or not. Like, I think this is something that's going to pop up into your brain because, like you said, Marcos, there is evil in the world. And I think that's the biggest place we have to start to answer that question is we believe there is evil in the world. And most people would agree with that. There's going to be some fringe cases like determinism and stuff like that. And, you know, it'd take too long for us to get into all of those kind of fringe views that people hold more as philosophical beliefs versus an actual reality. Again, for determinism, it doesn't actually come into how they affect their day-to-day lives, and a lot of people along those mindset. But beside the point. But anyway, the fact that evil exists in the world, as I said, is something most of us would agree on. And this is something that I think everyone has to come to grips with, no matter what your religious or your worldview might be. Like, this is a very prominent question, that evil exists, and I think it's something that everyone needs to have an answer to, just not Christians. So let's take a look, again, dive a little deeper into what evil is. Evil is something that is probably hard to define. For example, if I asked you right now, how would you define evil? It'd probably take a minute. I know the first time I fully thought about that definitely took me a little bit. One of the best answers that I think kind of encompasses is evil is a lack of something good or a corruption of something good. It is not something tangible in and of itself, but it can only exist when there is knowledge of good. For example, you can have good without having evil. That's what we had initially before the fall of man. You know, we had good. The creation was all very good, but we didn't have evil. However, you know, that evil did eventually enter into creation. So you must have good to be able to have evil. And this happens with many things we see in our society. For example, how can you know something is unfair without first knowing what fairness is? How can you know that a line is curved without knowing what a straight line is? A lot of these things. So things that fall into this category where evil would are a corruption of something else. So you must have the first object to begin with to be able to get to the second object. So I think that's very important to kind of recognize with all this, is when we talk about evil in the world, there is also good in this world, and we know what that is. So then that brings us to the question of how do we define the standard of what is good and evil? Obviously, for these to be such an overarching factor, there must be a moral law that is established by a higher being. And that's essentially, we won't get into all just kind of the philosophy behind that, but for there to be a moral law, it must be set by a morally superior being. We can't really set our own moral law, and I don't really think most people would want that to happen. While most people wouldn't take it to the extreme, people who set their own moral laws would be things like Hitler and the Holocaust, and there's many other examples throughout history. So I think we can clearly see that our moral law isn't subjective. It's not something we can come up with a reason to on our own. And this is actually a very popular debate today, kind of talking to amongst kind of non-believers or people who don't believe in a religious or, you know, a natural moral higher law, is can we reason our way to kind of like a moral law or something without there being like a superior moral law giver? And they've mostly failed in that argument. If that's something you're interested in, I'd advise just checking that out for yourself. There's lots of talks from both sides of that debate. But I think it's pretty well established that for there to be a moral law which can distinguish between good and evil, there must be a moral lawgiver. And that law is God. So, or it comes from God. So when we're looking at that, I think that's a big place to start. Now we look into, does the presence of evil mean there's not a good God? we've essentially gotten to the point that because there's evil, there must be, in a sense, God or some sort of morally superior creature who laid out the moral law to begin with. So does this, again, counter the example of a Christian God who is all good, perfect, and loving? And the answer to that simply is no. Next question. No, I'm just kidding. I think the easiest way is to go back and look at the garden before the fall. God created a world where evil was possible. That's not deniable. Evil was possible because God put that tree in the middle of the garden. So by choosing to eat of that fruit and disobey God, that made evil possible. However, he didn't make evil actual. It was Adam and Eve and their choice and their disobedience and their sin that caused evil to enter into creation. And that's the same way with us today. God has essentially established kind of the facts of freedom, or the facts of the moral law, or the boundaries. However, it is our actions that actually make the choice. So yes, God has created the framework. However, he doesn't make those choices for us. When I choose to do something wrong, that's all on me. That's on me. I'm the one who's responsible for that decision, not God. Because, again, I have the option to be able to do good. And that, again, kind of ties back into that whole free will thing. So, again, to kind of summarize, when people ask this question, and as I said, I think it's very important to bring up and have thought through because, again, evil does exist and there needs to be a reason for that. But, the simplest response is just because I'm evil. We're all evil. We have the ability to sin and do wrong. So we are the reason evil exists in the world today. And that can be a hard thing to come to grips with for people because I know a lot of people, there's a debate, is man naturally good or evil? And I think we see biblically, we are evil. You can look at the example, do you have to teach a child to lie, steal, hit, or do you have to teach them to do what's right? It's a common example, but I think it's very indicative of just our human nature. And that can be something that's hard to come to grips with. But I think that is an important first step, honestly, in the journey of faith, is realizing we are evil. I am evil. I'm a sinner. And there's really nothing I myself can do about that. And obviously, I think Gage will talk more about this. God created a plan and a way out of that because the punishment of this evil is death. But the fact that there's evil in this world is just simply because we are evil. God has, again, created this framework, but you and I operate in it. We have free will to choose to do what's good and to do what's wrong. So, in summary, I don't believe the existence of evil disproves that there's a good God. I think the existence of evil just proves that there are evil people.
What would you say, Gage?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to reiterate just a couple things because I think they're crucial and it's such a big question. In the sense that Josh mentioned, if we ask the question, why is there evil in the world today, we're assuming in part an absolute good and absolute evil. In the sense that we can all agree on some basic concepts of what is good and what is evil across the globe. Certainly there's minute differences between everyone's, morality and things like that. We're talking about the big essence of an absolute good and an absolute evil. And if we assume that, then we are assuming an absolute moral law. And with that, an absolute moral lawgiver, which is God. So to even ask the question, within the assumptions, we have to rely upon the fact that there is a God in order for there to be an absolute good and an absolute evil in the world. Like Josh mentioned too, God, by his grace and by his mercy, we must ask the question, later on of how long are we going to go on living like this? How long is there going to be evil in the world? Will God ever get rid of it? And the answer is yes. Eventually he will when he chooses to at his timing. The Bible very graciously lays out not only the past but also the future. And you can read for yourself the book of Revelation, things like that. Throughout the Bible, it talks about what God's going to do in order to extinguish evil from the world. Before even that, though, we must recognize that, it says in Romans 6:23, for the wages of sin is death, but the free gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus. And first of all, to basically justify our wrongdoing, God is going to bring every act to judgment. So every sin that we commit, every wrongdoing that we do is going to be judged by God. And, as Christians, we understand, and I hope you can understand that what really matters is whether or not that sin is going to be placed upon ourselves or on Jesus, which ultimately leads into eternal life. But stay tuned for a salvation video on more of that. But essentially, going back to the Bible and what's going to come, eventually the devil, Satan, his demons are all going to be thrown into what the Bible calls the lake of fire. God is eventually going to extinguish them for all eternity. He's going to set up a new heaven and a new earth, and we're all going to live as believers in perfect harmony without evil with God forever.
Yeah, just to kind of finish off what Gage said, I think it's important to realize that, especially as Christians, we need to recognize that while evil hasn't yet been completely destroyed on this earth, and it will, on the day of judgment after God's second coming and the final push by Satan, evil will be destroyed once and forever. Like Gage said, Satan and his demons will be cast into the lake of fire for all eternity. But I think it is important for us to realize that, or remember, evil has already been defeated. Jesus did that by dying on the cross and then being resurrected 3 days later. That concluded the defeat of evil. Now, while it hasn't been completely destroyed yet, I think it is very important to just remember and hold that in our hearts, that evil has already been defeated. And while it's almost like a snake with its head chopped off, still swinging its tail a little bit, like its time is numbered and it will be completely destroyed.
That's a great point. I'll run off that real quick. I think one of the biggest lies that you will hear is that God and Satan are constantly battling one another. That is an absolute lie, because there is absolutely no comparison between the two. God is far more superior and infinitely better than Satan will ever be. And so God is not constantly battling Satan. Satan's already lost that war. He knows he's lost. God is simply allowing him, like we read in the book of Job, that God allows Satan to enter into Job's life and enter into our lives, which can be deceptive and bring about evil in the world. And that's just something that God allows. It's not because the two are battling each other. God has already won that battle. I think it's just an important distinction that we make. As Josh said, God has defeated evil. He knows the outcome. It simply just hasn't been, extinguished yet from all of our lives.
Very interesting. So then you're mentioning that Satan is actually the one more or less bringing evil into our lives, right?
Yes, so obviously Satan, I want to clarify something real quick, just for things. Satan is a supernatural being. He's cast out by God, but he can't be everywhere at once. Satan, and he has his demons. What's especially present in the world today is we see all the systems, like kind of Satan and his demons have set up for evil. That's what's really at work in our world today. Now, it is very possible Satan does attack people on an individual level. I think that's important to remember too, is Satan's systems are present all throughout the world. You just look at all the corruption and immorality, and again, some of these have human fault too, but Satan and his demons are at work. And again, they can work on individuals, and fight individuals, and that does happen. I don't want to discount that. However, I think that is just an important distinction to make, is we are being tempted, and part of it's just by our own evil nature, that we have that sin nature built in inside us. But we will more often than not be tempted by the systems that Satan and his demons have created on earth.
That's a good analogy with systems. Very interesting. So then we'll go ahead on to the next question. So we've talked about these personal evils, right? And so what about impersonal evils, such as natural disasters? What would you say to that, Gage?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very fair and essential question, in the fact that, everyone at some point in their life is going to be impacted by, if we take natural disasters, for instance, people are going to be hurt by it, killed by it. They know someone, at least, who's been impacted by one of these disasters. And essentially, why would God, allow such a thing to happen? And essentially, I think, first, we need to realize the perspective that this question is being asked in the sense that, kind of as we talked about before, if we look at the assumptions within the question, it has to be asked from a Christian perspective, because, like a naturalist scientist or someone like that has to fight with the idea that in order to call it evil, they have to fight with the idea of an absolute moral law, and therefore bring God into the picture, which they don't want to do. Other religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, will simply call it karma. Maybe we deserved it, something like that. A Muslim might just say it's the will of Allah. But a Christian, really, if we understand, like we talked about, we do serve a good God. So then why would a good God allow something like this to happen? Another point to make here is that fire, or like swirling winds, or just fast moving water isn't innately evil. There's nothing evil with that. Like, we need fire to survive sometimes, and so there's nothing evil about it. We simply bring evil into the picture when it affects our lives. It's the effect of the cause. And so essentially, I think at its basic form, we kind of need to realize that it's kind of the same thing with pain. God allows these things to happen ultimately for his purposes. Like he wouldn't let them happen if he didn't want them to happen. So essentially we need to ask, can God use something like a natural disaster? Can he use pain in our lives, grief, in order to bring them closer to him? Absolutely he can. He can do amazing things with that. And I think he does do amazing things with that. So essentially we must understand these natural disasters. I'm not saying they're a good thing, and I really don't want people to be hurt or killed by them or things like that. We must understand it's often probably part of God's bigger plan for our life that these things do happen, and a lot of people do come closer to God because of events like this.
So my question is, I thought that this kingdom, the earth, the system of things, right, belonged to Satan. So would you say that natural disasters is also one of these systems?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I'd say it's honestly possible with some of them. I think some of the things we see, obviously, are just natural in one sense. I don't deny, I honestly have no clue what Satan's power structure would look like. So it is very possible that he has the ability to maybe help push, manifest some of those. I honestly don't know that question. I think one thing that's important, like you said, like this is, God allows Satan to work on this earth. And he, in a sense, this is all still God's kingdom, but God hasn't fully brought his kingdom onto earth yet. And like I said, he will do that in his second coming, but he does allow Satan to operate. But kind of like we said earlier, they're not at war. God lets Satan operate in certain areas in certain ways, but Satan doesn't have complete dominion. Satan can't just go around and kill, every pastor or every John MacArthur, great Christian leader. God doesn't allow that. That's not within, the scope of what he's been given on this earth. And honestly, at times it is hard to say. Reading through the story of Job is definitely very interesting to just kind of see just what that looks like and how God uses that. So I think to give a very, non-committal answer to your question, maybe. I'm honestly not sure. Like, it's really hard. None of us know Satan's powers or, his demons. We know he is supernatural and does have the ability to move and work with the earth. No one knows. It actually talks a little bit in, I believe it's Jude, about some of that, about the people who, the ignorant fools will actually mock, supernatural beings such as Satan. And that's a form of ignorance and just bad on their part. So we never want to, deny the power and the influence they could have. But I think it's also important to remember, as we said, if God doesn't want something to happen, it won't happen. It's just as simple as that. And I think one last point that's kind of just good to remember with all this is when Adam and Eve first sinned, obviously evil entered the world and they fell, but sin also entered into the all of creation. Now, we don't per se know exactly what all that looks like, but some of these natural disasters and things we see are, in a sense, just the natural consequences of sin entering in the world. My guess were hurricanes weren't part of God's original design for the world. I can't, say that with 100% certainty. But when we look at some of these certain natural disasters, some of these also were probably present as, again, just sin entering into the world and the earth we have and corrupting that as well.
Going back, if I understand your original question, you kind of is it possible that Satan is the one kind of prompting these natural disasters and things like that? And I think basically kind of similar to Josh, it's highly possible, maybe probable at some points, but I think it's important to realize that it is ultimately God allowing that to happen. If God wanted to shut that down, he would. He is in the complete ability to do so. Kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier in the sense that God can use bad things for good purposes per se. A lot of times we don't necessarily see the good that's going to come along beside of it. If we're evangelizing to someone, it's the first time they hear the gospel, I guarantee they're not going to come to Christ at that point. I mean, they could. But we don't see the long-term effects. Similarly, if God, promotes a hurricane, tsunami, or something like that, it's going to hurt for a while, and we may never see what God actually does with it. I mean, similarly, a dog analogy, if you take your dog to the vet to get a shot or something, they don't really understand why they're being, hurt, have this pain of a needle going inside of them. But as the owner, that it's ultimately for their good. The dog may not see that. He may be angry for a time, but you do see the ultimate purpose. Similar to God sees the ultimate purposes for why he operates the way he does.
Yes, I like that analogy. Would you, I don't know if you've already done this part, but would you talk a little bit more about emotional response?
Essentially, the last bit we want to say to anyone watching, and we have to remind ourselves a lot of the time, is that everyone at some point in their life, maybe it's now, maybe it's years ago, maybe it's to come, will be really hurting because of, something evil that someone did to them or something evil that's working in their own lives. And we understand that the answers that, we've given, that a lot of apologists give or theologians, are not going to suffice a lot of the time. A lot of times you don't want a logical explanation as to why, your family member just died. I've been there myself, and you don't necessarily want, you serve a good God, things like that. And we understand that. We understand that, like, pain sucks a lot of the time, to put it blatantly. And so I think it's important that we understand the logic behind it. And we understand that we do serve a good God, even when it may not seem like it. But in those instances, I encourage you, first of all, to pray about it. And if there's something that we could pray for you about, if you want to have a deeper conversation with us about what it looks like to kind of respond to these difficult circumstances, please reach out to us. We'd love to assist you from our own experiences and maybe provide biblical advice if we can in any area. But we understand that a lot of times it is emotional, and it's hard to deal with questions like this as we go through the hardships. If it's fresh in our mind, a death or like a natural disaster like we talked about, a lot of time we don't want the logical answer, and we understand that. So we just encourage you to pray about it, to think about it, to always come back to God and bring it to Him. Because God wants us to do that. He wants us to be reliant upon Him. And a lot of times that's maybe why He's bringing something along in your life. And so we just need to understand that God is there for us 100% of the time, because that's what He promised. And God never backs down on any of His promises.
I think what Gage said is very important. If someone asks you this question, or were to ask me this question, why is there still evil in the world today or something, a lot of times it is coming from that personal experience. Like he said, we've all been there. And I think it's important to, too, like when you're engaging people, is to try and find out the source of the question. Like, it is possible there could be a time in their life, or for certain people, where it is kind of, a logical thing that doesn't make sense in their mind. But like Gage said, like if you just lost a family member yesterday, like there's nothing, when looking at it from just kind of like apologist logic standpoint, that's really going to help much, or at least at that moment. Maybe there is in the future. I really don't know. We're all wired differently, but like Gage said, like it is so important just to be able to like listen, maybe just try and hear out, understand people's hurts, and again, just love on them, pray for them, pray with them if they'll allow you, but at the very least, again, just pray over them, for God's hand of healing and comfort to work there, because we'll all need that at one point and another. But at the very least, we also hope too that it can just be encouraging to know that, there are answers to this question. It is a very hard question. I think it's very good, but there are, if it is something you're looking to have, a conversation about at a certain point, maybe after the healing's done, or, a lot of time, there's a time, the need for just that loving, just showing that love of Christ to someone, praying. A lot of times that'll come first, but if people do hit, later point, like, I am kind of curious, how could they let this happen, and I want to engage. Like, there are answers, there are people, who have thought about this question, and there are things we can just kind of take away from God's character in the Bible. And it may not always suffice, but hopefully that is, at the very least, an encouragement to people.
I just want to add one touch on that. Josh mentioned it. I'm really glad he did, about loving people. And I think essentially we try to offer good answers to good questions. But if you're trying to give someone answers to their questions, the most important thing that you need to do for them is love them. We try to give good answers because we love people and we want them to know the truth. And more importantly than any good answer, Paul makes this very clear in all of his letters, is that he doesn't come with persuasive arguments. He doesn't come with fancy clothing, anything like that. He comes with love to these people. And that's the most important thing that you can do for anyone else, or even in your own life, is just to love others. And the rest will ultimately fall into place.
A lot of people's maybe problem with God or religion a lot of times isn't logical. There might be components to that, and there's definitely, I think, a few people who fall into that camp with how they're wired. But a lot of times it is just kind of like maybe more of an emotional or more of like a moral issue, they have with God. And, a lot of times, again, we want to provide answers to certain questions that we think are important and can definitely be helpful in their place. But, a lot of times it is important to just get to the heart of that and just love them, show them that love of Christ, share with them the good news. And, a lot of times that needs to come first, and a lot of times that will be, the most and best thing you can share. There will be, honestly, a lot of like these questions will be like, apologist responses will be the minority of responses we make with people. Like these questions do definitely come up, but again, like a lot of people's problem with God isn't just logical, otherwise there'd probably be a lot more believers. That's just not how the world works. But it is so important to just, just talk to people, build those relationships, get to the heart of those questions, if they can, get to the heart of that hurt and just pray with them and love them. And that will just help lead forward as we work with just sharing that good news and trying to expand God's kingdom.
Nice. Well, that's it for this video. Thank you.
Hey guys, thank you so much for watching that video. We hope you really enjoyed it.
Leave us your thoughts in the comments or email us at the email shown in the description.
For more in-depth content, check out our blog. The link is below.
Don't forget to hit the subscribe, like, and notification.